On the 4th day of June in the year 1943, along Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas, a pencil quivered slightly in the hand of Unificia Vera Burkhart. He meticulously inscribed words into his concealed journal, revelations that, if discovered by his own superiors, would have undoubtedly led to his solitary confinement. He confided to the pages, "The Americans must be fabricating their accounts. No single nation could possibly sustain such an abundance of resources while engaged in conflict on two separate fronts." Just moments before, as he gazed out the window of the passing train, he had witnessed a spectacle that directly contradicted 3 years of relentless Nazi propaganda. Electric lights blazed with vibrant intensity from every solitary farmhouse, illuminated every bustling street corner, and gleamed from countless shop windows. It was an unending constellation of electrical brilliance stretching across the vast Texas plains, long past 10 o'clock at night. Back in Germany, stringent blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into an oppressive darkness since the year 1940. Even prior to the outbreak of hostilities, rural electrification had managed to reach a mere 20% of German farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had depicted as a decadent and crumbling America, electricity flowed as freely as water. 1,850 veterans of Irwin RML's Africa Corps disembarked from the passenger train. They were not ushered into cattle cars or humble freight wagons, but rather into plush Pullman coaches, complete with dining services and sleeping accommodations. The entire populace of Mexia had gathered to witness their arrival. What none of them could possibly have known was that this singular moment would initiate the most profound psychological transformation in modern history. It would be a systematic dismantling of Nazi ideology, achieved through the sheer, unadulterated display of American industrial might. The intricate mathematics of Allied victory were not being formulated on battle plans, but rather were being etched into production statistics that would soon obliterate every preconception these soldiers held regarding their adversaries, their homeland, and the very cause for which they fought. The collapse had begun on the 13th day of May in 1943 in the territory of Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, who had succeeded Rommel, surrendered along with an estimated 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The exact numbers fluctuated as scattered units continued to yield over several subsequent days. The Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert warriors, men who had previously driven the British forces back to the borders of Egypt, soldiers who had earned the grudging admiration of even Montgomery himself, were now suddenly prisoners of war. Among their ranks was Hidman Friedrich Radke, a recipient of the Iron Cross First Class, a veteran of the French campaign, and a man who had sustained 2 wounds during the North African conflict. His diary, unearthed decades later within the hallowed halls of the National Archives, would ultimately provide historians with the most comprehensive account of the psychological impact experienced by German soldiers during their captivity to Sieif, America. The journey from utter defeat to profound revelation commenced in the bustling port of Oran, Algeria, as Radke and 30,000 other prisoners languished in makeshift encampments, awaiting transport ships. The stark efficiency of the American forces began to shatter their deeply ingrained preconceptions. The United States Army processed thousands of captured personnel on a daily basis, exhibiting an organizational precision that surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had ever achieved, even at the zenith of its formidable power. Identity cards were meticulously photographed and filed. Comprehensive medical examinations were conducted, inoculations administered without delay, and the fundamental rights afforded under the Geneva Convention were clearly explained in impeccable German by American officers who had received specialized training for precisely this critical juncture. However, the initial and truly startling shock was delivered by the food. Oberrichter Hans Mühr, captured alongside the 21st Panzer Division, penned a letter to his mother 8 months later, recounting his experiences. In the enclosure at Oran, he wrote, "While we awaited the ships, the Americans provided us with sustenance superior to anything we had consumed during 6 months of desert warfare. We were served white bread, genuine coffee, and meat twice daily. Initially, we believed this was merely propaganda, a concerted effort to impress us. We failed to grasp that this was their standard military ration. The Liberty ships, destined to transport them across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, were themselves colossal monuments to American industrial prowess. The SS Robert E. Peary, a vessel of remarkable construction, had been completed in an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards located in Richmond, California. This extraordinary feat, had the Germans been aware of it, would have been readily dismissed as impossible propaganda. These maritime vessels, produced at a staggering rate of 3 per day during the peak of their manufacturing, were returning from delivering essential supplies to the European theater of operations. Rather than return to port empty, they were utilized to carry human cargo, accommodating up to 30,000 prisoners of war each month by the summer of 1943. The fortnight-long Atlantic crossing during July of 1943 marked the second phase of this psychological demolition. Feld Kurt Zimmerman of the 90th Light Division meticulously documented his experiences in detailed accounts, preserved in letters to his family following his repatriation. "The ship's crew," he observed, "discarded more food waste each day than my entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months of our deployment in Africa." Zimmerman continued, "The American sailors would toss aside half-eaten steaks, entire loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had sat too long. They did this openly, without a second thought, not in an attempt to mock us, but because to them, such waste was inconsequential. Their supply was virtually limitless, the very ships themselves transformed into floating classrooms, imparting lessons on American might. Prisoners discovered that the vessel transporting them was merely one out of a total of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be constructed throughout the duration of the war. Each of these ships necessitated the assembly of 250,000 individual parts, meticulously manufactured in 32 different states. The engines, as they learned from garrulous American guards, were produced in 3 separate factories, each facility capable of generating 900 horsepower cylinders, which were subsequently assembled in ports that had scarcely existed 2 years prior. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian lineage had a distinguished history of service in every German conflict since the era of Frederick the Great, would later articulate in his memoirs, "As our vessel approached the American coastline, I observed the radar antenna rotating ceaselessly above the bridge. This technology, which we believed was possessed only by ourselves and perhaps in limited quantities by the British, was standard equipment on a mere cargo vessel. It was at that precise moment," he confessed, "that he first harbored the suspicion that Germany had already met its defeat. On the 2nd day of August in the year 1943, at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the initial sight of America completely obliterated the last vestiges of Nazi propaganda concerning America's supposed industrial frailty. The Norfolk base sprawled across an immense 4,300 acres, its docks extending for miles, its colossal cranes diligently loading and unloading dozens of ships concurrently. In the span of a single day, this solitary port managed to handle a greater volume of tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg processed in a week. General Major Johann Weber, formerly a factory worker from the Ruhr region before his conscription, meticulously counted 47 cargo ships undergoing various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his clandestine diary, was capable of lifting loads that would have necessitated a dozen men and numerous horses in Germany. They moved with the effortless grace of electric power, smoothly, continuously, devoid of the choking coal smoke that perpetually afflicted our industrial cities. The prisoners were then organized into orderly columns, prepared for the march to the waiting trains. Along their designated route, they passed vast parking lots overflowing with civilian automobiles, hundreds upon hundreds of them, all belonging to the dock workers. In Germany, private vehicle ownership remained an exclusive privilege reserved for the affluent and the elite members of the party. The Volkswagen, a vehicle promised to the German populace since 1934, persistently remained an elusive propaganda dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, however, ordinary laborers arrived at their places of employment in their very own cars, but nothing could have truly prepared them for the trains themselves. These were not rudimentary boxcars, nor were they the cramped 40-and-8 wagons, designed to transport 40 men or 8 horses, that had ferried German troops across Europe. Instead, they were fully equipped passenger coaches. These were Pullman cars, featuring plush, padded seats that ingeniously converted into comfortable sleeping berths. There were dining cars adorned with pristine white tablecloths and gleaming silver cutlery, and observation cars offered panoramic windows for unparalleled views. Hedman Radke eloquently recorded his sentiment, stating, "We boarded as if we were tourists, not prisoners of war." The American guards themselves appeared almost apologetic regarding the unexpected level of comfort. One sergeant offered a personal apology, lamenting that the air conditioning system in their particular car was not functioning optimally. Air conditioning? In the sweltering heat of August, they had firmly believed such an amenity existed solely on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day rail journey from Norfolk to the internment camps located in Texas and Oklahoma would prove to be more devastating to the prevailing Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains traversed through the state of Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces intently against the windows, witnessing an America that, according to every narrative they had been fed, simply could not exist. Every diminutive town blazed with an astonishing illumination. Communities like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro, which in Germany would have considered themselves fortunate to possess a solitary electric street lamp, here proudly displayed brightly lit shop windows, vibrant electric signs, and homes where lights burned brightly in multiple rooms. The trains passed by factories operating through the night, their windows glowing invitingly, their parking lots brimming with vehicles even at the stroke of midnight. Obergefreiter Mayer, whose father had been a dedicated Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter that was subsequently discovered in 1987, "We journeyed through dozens of cities that first night. Every single one possessed more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. The guards informed us that this was considered normal, that every American town had enjoyed access to electricity since the 1920s. I accused him of being a liar. He merely shrugged and replied that we would soon see for ourselves." In Roanoke, Virginia, the train made a halt to replenish its water and coal reserves. The prisoners watched intently as American railway workers accomplished in 30 minutes what would have required a laborious 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, efficient electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems were all on display. Every facet of the operation demonstrably showcased a profound technological superiority. Even more unsettling was the casual display of affluence exhibited by the workers themselves. They wore sturdy leather boots that would have represented 2 months' wages for a typical German laborer. They sipped Coca-Cola directly from glass bottles, discarding the empties into waste receptacles without the slightest hesitation. They smoked cigarettes continuously, often stubbing them out, only partially consumed. Failed soldier Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer hailing from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard where they had stopped consumed more electricity in a mere hour than his entire district in Berlin, utilized in a full day. "The waste was magnificent," he poignantly wrote. "They left lights burning in unoccupied buildings. Electric fans hummed in vacant rooms. It was the careless abandon of infinite resource." As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered the full, unbridled display of American industrial might. Through the windows of their carriages, they observed endless stretches of factories, each one surpassing in size anything most of them had ever witnessed in their native Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee extended for 3 miles along the riverbank, its electric furnaces voraciously consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, a consumption exceeding that of the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains perceptibly slowed their pace as they glided past the Rubbertown complex, where colossal synthetic rubber plants had erupted from previously barren fields in a mere 18 months. These were 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers and collectively producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite having pioneered the very process, had never managed to produce more than 120,000 tons in its most productive year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist affiliated with IG Farben, grasped the full implications of this industrial panorama immediately. In a post-war interview, he vividly recalled, "I recognized those plants. I could discern the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was demonstrably more advanced than anything we had ever constructed, and there were 4 of them, concentrated in this single location. We were informed that there were dozens more distributed across the country. The trains continued their eastward trajectory, passing Ford's Willow Run plant, situated just outside Detroit, a structure so immense it was visible from miles away. This singular factory, erected in a remarkably short period of just 9 months, was capable of producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At its zenith of production, 42,000 workers were engaged in assembling bombers from an astonishing 1,550,000 parts, manufactured by 1,500 individual subcontractors. The plant encompassed an astounding 2.5 million square feet of floor space and consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hutman Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face firmly against the window as they passed. He meticulously counted 17 B-24 aircraft in various stages of assembly, all clearly visible from the train. We had been indoctrinated with the notion that American aircraft were inferior, he admitted, hastily constructed and prone to falling apart in combat. However, I could clearly discern the precision of the assembly lines, the impeccable quality of the construction. These were not substandard aircraft. They were, quite simply, manufactured at a pace we had previously deemed utterly impossible. The deeper the trains penetrated into the American landscape, the more complete became the disintegration of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the mighty Mississippi River via the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges laden with grain moved downstream, carrying a volume of foodstuffs that surpassed the entirety of the German harvest in 1942. The prisoners could observe immense grain elevators stretching along both riverbanks, each one purportedly holding sufficient wheat to sustain an entire German city for months on end. Unfiltered Karl Schmidt, the son of a farmer from Bavaria, meticulously recorded in his diary, "The Americans transport food with the same lack of concern for loss that we reserve for ammunition, in quantities that seem truly endless. I witnessed them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years." The crane operator was enjoying a sandwich piled high with meat, the thickness of which exceeded our weekly meat ration. In Kansas City, the train came to a halt at a colossal stockyard, where tens of thousands of cattle awaited their fate. The pervasive aroma of meatpacking plants permeated the air for miles around. German prisoners, who had subsisted on a meager 200 grams of meat per week in Africa when fortunate, now observed American workers casually consuming beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks. "They consume meat as we consume bread," wrote grieving soldier Paul Fisher. No, that's not quite accurate. They ate meat as we wished we could eat bread. The guard procured hamburgers for them from a nearby stand. The description was vivid: meat, cheese, and vegetables nestled within soft white bread, all for a mere 15 cents. He purchased 20 of these without a moment's hesitation, paying with a $1 bill. This was not a special treat, he reflected. This was their everyday sustenance. The arrival at the internment camps themselves constituted the subsequent echelon of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, constructed in an astonishingly short period of just 4 months, provided housing for between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that surpassed what most had experienced even as civilians. The barracks were constructed of wood and featured electric lighting, flush toilets, hot showers, and central steam heating. Each individual building was constructed using more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital proved to be a source of profound astonishment for the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself within a facility that was demonstrably better equipped than the majority of German civilian hospitals. It boasted advanced X-ray machines, state-of-the-art surgical equipment, and an ample supply of pharmaceuticals that had been virtually unavailable in Germany since 1941. All of these amenities were considered standard provisions for enemy prisoners. They possessed penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, that miraculous drug we had only encountered in whispered rumors. They administered it liberally, even to prisoners suffering from minor infections. German soldiers were succumbing to treatable ailments due to a lack of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were providing us with their most advanced medical treatments without any apparent hesitation. The camp kitchen emerged as another, illuminating classroom in the realities of American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to culinary duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, powerful electric mixers, fully automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for an astonishing 5,000 men. The daily ration consistently included fresh milk, eggs, a generous portion of meat, an abundance of vegetables, and the staple of white bread, quantities that German civilians had not witnessed since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, penned in his account, "Today, we discarded more food than my entire family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, mind you, simply an excess. The American regulations mandate that we prepare 10% more than what is strictly necessary to ensure that every prisoner receives their full ration. The surplus is then disposed of. I wept openly as I threw perfectly good bread into the refuse bins." By September of 1943, a significant labor shortage within American agriculture necessitated the employment of prisoners of war in fields and factories across the nation. This decision, driven purely by pragmatic necessity, would ultimately prove more impactful than any orchestrated propaganda program could have ever achieved. Groups of prisoners were transported daily via truck to various work sites, traversing the American heartland without the encumbrance of blindfolds or any form of restricted travel routes. They were afforded the opportunity to witness everything firsthand: the seemingly endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories humming with activity across 3 shifts, the bustling shops overflowing with merchandise, the parking lots packed with automobiles, and the houses equipped with modern refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin located just outside Houston, Unratia Herbert Lang observed a single machine processing more cotton in a single hour than his entire village could have managed in a month, utilizing traditional manual methods. The gin itself was powered by electricity sourced from the Colorado River Authority, a testament to a rural electrification program that had successfully brought power to 90% of Texas farms by the year 1943. The farmer who owned this particular gin, Lang recorded, was by no means an exceptional individual. He was neither an aristocrat nor a member of the ruling party, simply a farmer. Yet he possessed electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including those of African descent, partook in their midday meal from lunchboxes that contained more sustenance than a German worker would receive in an entire week. And this was considered normal, Lang emphasized. Every farm we passed exhibited the same characteristics. In Nebraska, prisoners were engaged in working in sugar beet fields, where they witnessed agricultural mechanization that defied their comprehension. A single combine harvester, they learned, possessed the capacity to perform the labor of 100 men. The fields stretched out towards the horizon, each one appearing larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of crop yields that would have been considered pure fantasy in Germany, with wheat yields of 60 bushels per acre compared to Germany's 30 bushels per acre, even on their most fertile land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm near Scottsbluff, meticulously wrote, "The farmer's son, a mere boy of 16, was driving a tractor that was worth more than everything my father had earned in his entire lifetime. When I tentatively mentioned this observation, the young boy simply laughed and replied that it wasn't even a particularly exceptional tractor. His father, he explained, was awaiting the arrival of a new model from John Deere that was expected to be even superior." The most profoundly devastating revelations, however, were reserved for those prisoners who found themselves working in close proximity to or within American factories. While the strictures of the Geneva Convention ostensibly prohibited prisoners from engaging in direct war production activities, they were permitted to work in industries that effectively freed up American workers for military production. This carefully crafted technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to gain first-hand exposure to the immense scale of American industrial capacity. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in an entire month. The facility operated with a remarkably lean crew, composed primarily of women and elderly men, as the majority of younger male workers were serving in the military. Yet, despite this reduced workforce, production levels consistently exceeded pre-war peacetime output. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had previously worked in a German food processing plant before the war, meticulously documented his observations of the experience. Everything was automated, he stated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, and steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman was responsible for monitoring controls that managed a process which, in Germany, would have required the labor of 50 workers. She performed this task while casually listening to the radio and sipping coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners engaged in unloading coal at a power plant were granted fleeting glimpses of the automotive industry's monumental conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, clearly visible across the water, employed a staggering 100,000 workers, dedicated to the production of jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. This colossal plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, a figure exceeding the consumption of the entire city of Hamburg. "We could clearly see the parking lots," wrote Oberrichter Franz Kellner, "that thousands upon thousands of cars belonging to the workers in Germany. Even our own officers rarely possessed automobiles. Here, factory laborers drove to their jobs. The guard informed us that many workers owned 2 cars, one designated for work and another for family use. We initially believed he was attempting to deceive us. By the winter of 1943, the cumulative impact of these widespread observations had begun to manifest what American intelligence officers termed ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoner population. The Special Projects Division, a clandestine re-education initiative overseen by the Provost Marshal General's Office, meticulously documented an increasing number of prisoners formally requesting access to American newspapers, books, and various educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring team, submitted a report in December of 1943, stating, "The prisoners no longer engage in arguments when presented with production statistics. They have witnessed too much evidence to the contrary. The most fervent Nazis have fallen silent. While they continue to profess loyalty to Germany, they no longer speak of imminent victory." Numerous individuals openly question the narratives they were previously fed about America. The camp newspapers, independently produced by the prisoners themselves, began to reflect this profound internal transformation. Der Ruf, the publication circulated at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted its editorial focus from staunch, defiant nationalism to earnest discussions concerning democracy, alternative economic systems, and the intricacies of post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected from among the anti-Nazi prisoners, discovered their audience to be increasingly receptive to these new perspectives. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured alongside the 10th Panzer Division, conveyed in a letter that successfully passed American censorship, "I have seen the truth, and it is undeniable. America's strength is not just in its armies, but in its factories, its farms, and the boundless spirit of its people. Our propaganda painted a false picture, and the reality we have witnessed has shattered it completely. We were repeatedly told that America was a fragmented society, lacking strength and unity, supposedly under Jewish control, and inherently incapable of military greatness. Yet, every day I spent here revealed the stark opposite. This nation stands as the most remarkably organized, unified, and formidable on the planet. The narratives we received from those in power were nothing more than elaborate falsehoods. The most significant challenge to Nazi ideology originated from an entirely unexpected quarter: the treatment of Italian prisoners following Italy's capitulation in September of 1943. Italian prisoners of war who chose to collaborate were integrated into Italian service units. These soldiers were provided with superior accommodations, increased financial compensation, and considerably more personal liberty. German prisoners observed their former allies working alongside Americans, dining in American eateries, and some were even seen in romantic relationships with American women. Hedman Friedrich Schultz noted in his writings, "The Italians have betrayed us, and still, they are treated with greater consideration than we showed them when they were our allies. They move about freely, earn wages, and dispatch packages to their homes. The Americans display no animosity towards them. This system of democracy, which we were indoctrinated to disdain, appears to possess a greater degree of honor than our own." Christmas of 1943 served as the catalyst for the most profound psychological shift. American organizations, religious institutions, and community groups dispatched 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners of war, individuals who, mere months prior, had been actively seeking to end the lives of American servicemen, Each package contained essentials such as cigarettes, confectionery, toiletries, and various forms of amusement. Local communities extended invitations to prisoners for Christmas feasts, although regulations regrettably prevented the majority from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir delivered a moving performance of Christmas carols sung in German for the incarcerated men. Women from Hearn also contributed homemade cookies and cakes, while the Boy Scouts presented handcrafted Christmas cards. This remarkable display of benevolence towards former adversaries effectively dismantled the final vestiges of Nazi racial dogma. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had perished during the bombing of Hamburg, articulated his thoughts. "They are aware of our enmity. Numerous among them have sons and husbands engaged in combat against our forces. Despite this, they extend to us Christian compassion, not through manufactured propaganda, but through genuine kindness. What sort of people exhibit such treatment towards their enemies? Only those who possess an unshakable conviction in their inevitable triumph and are secure in their dominion." The Christmas repast itself was beyond comprehension. Roasted turkey, ham, mashed potatoes generously doused in gravy, an array of vegetables, an assortment of pies, and ice cream. The sheer abundance of food surpassed anything Germany had experienced since the period preceding the First World War. The prisoners indulged to the point of illness, utterly incapable of grasping the notion of such lavish resources being bestowed upon their enemies. "We dined like royalty," Feldwebel Hansa recorded, "far better than the meals served to German generals, and superior even to those enjoyed by our party leaders." This was not an exceptional arrangement. The guards informed them that this was a standard American Christmas dinner, and that every American family was partaking in an identical meal. The implication was inescapable. If prisoners were afforded such fare, what must the dietary provisions be for their own soldiers? By early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in comprehensive educational programs. Their studies encompassed English language acquisition, the intricacies of American history, advanced mathematics, and various scientific disciplines. The University of Chicago provided specialized correspondence courses, and Stanford University dispatched esteemed professors to deliver lectures on the principles of democracy and economic theory. The prisoners' thirst for knowledge was virtually insatiable. Those who had been led to believe that Americans were uncultured savages discovered vast libraries housing millions of books, educational institutions that welcomed individuals from all societal strata, and scientific research that had firmly established itself as a global leader. They were permitted to freely peruse American newspapers, engaging with a multitude of differing perspectives, an experience utterly unattainable in Nazi Germany. Haumann Drive. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist who had been conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later penned, "American academics, including Jewish expatriates from Germany, instructed us without any trace of animosity. They spoke of science as a universal pursuit, belonging to all of humankind. Their research was years ahead of German advancements, and they willingly shared their discoveries with their adversaries." This magnanimity of spirit was simply incomprehensible to minds conditioned by Nazi ideology. The camp theaters screened American films, not as vehicles for state-sponsored propaganda, but as mainstream Hollywood productions. Prisoners viewed Gone with the Wind, witnessing a portrayal of American defeat and subsequent recovery that resonated deeply with their own circumstances. They also saw The Grapes of Wrath, a film that astonished them by its candid depiction of American struggles, a level of self-criticism they found astounding to be presented to enemies. "They conceal nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They expose their challenges, their setbacks, their internal conflicts. Yet, this candor seems to fortify them, rather than weaken them. In Germany, such criticism would invariably lead to severe repercussions, even death. Here, however, it is regarded as an act of patriotism. The spring of 1944 ushered in an expansion of prisoner labor initiatives as American industrial output reached its zenith. German prisoners of war labored in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, gaining first-hand exposure to the full might of American manufacturing capacity. The sheer numbers involved told a story that no amount of propaganda could effectively counter. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners were tasked with unloading steel destined to become landing craft for the D-Day invasion. They observed firsthand the assembly of 700 boats per month, each requiring 20,000 individual components. The factory itself employed 20,000 workers, a significant portion of whom were women operating heavy machinery like cranes, welding holes, and overseeing production lines. Stabsfeld-Weibel. Kurt Zimmerman documented his observations. Women performing tasks traditionally assigned to men, individuals of color operating sophisticated machinery, teenagers managing drilling equipment. All aspects of production that we were taught were impossible within a democratic framework. Yet, production never faltered. Operations ran continuously across 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a single month, they manufactured more boats than our entire Navy had constructed in an entire year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the daily production of 10,000 tons of steel. The immense blast furnaces operated without interruption, constantly fed by an endless procession of trains carrying iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The sheer scale of this operation defied German comprehension. This single facility alone produced more steel than the entire Ruhr Valley had managed at its peak. I worked at Krupp before the war, recalled Oberweiter Paul Hartmann. I believed I understood industrial production, but this surpassed all imagination. They would discard more steel through spillage than our entire output could achieve. The workers would lament about working overtime, while simultaneously producing quantities that we could not replicate even with forced labor and double shifts. The summer harvest of 1944 delivered the final blow to Nazi propaganda. Concerning American weakness, German prisoners were deployed across the Midwestern states, where they witnessed agricultural production capabilities that could sustain the entire global population. In Kansas, they observed wheat harvests on farms where a single operation yielded more grain than entire German provinces. Massive combine harvesters traversed the fields like vessels upon a golden ocean, each capable of harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled possessed the capacity to store more wheat than Germany had imported in a full calendar year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer hailing from East Prussia, recounted his encounter with an American farmer. One American farmer, equipped with machinery, accomplishes the work of 100 German farmers. He described being shown aerial photographs of wheat fields stretching for thousands of square miles. He realized they could sustain a crop loss of 50% and still possess a greater quantity of grain than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners harvested fruit in vast orchards that extended as far as the eye could see. They observed perfectly good fruit being discarded due to minor cosmetic imperfections, fruit that would have been considered a treasure in Germany. Entire harvests were occasionally plowed under to maintain market prices, a concept that induced significant psychological distress among prisoners accustomed to the food scarcity of wartime Germany. They destroyed food to preserve stable prices, reported Gerritor Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits simply because there was an overabundance. We pleaded to be allowed to send them to our families in Germany. The guards expressed sympathy, but explained it was an impossibility. This waste was a deliberate demonstration of their limitless resources. June 6, 1944. Upon receiving news of the Normandy invasion, German prisoners experienced their ultimate ideological collapse. The sheer magnitude of the operation, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the initial assault wave, showcased an American organizational capability that far surpassed even the wildest conjectures of Nazi Germany. Prisoners at Camp Shelby viewed newsreels of the invasion within days of its commencement. They witnessed the seemingly endless convoys of ships, the ingenious construction of artificial harbors, and the sophisticated logistical network that transported 15,000 tons of supplies daily across exposed beaches. They observed their homeland being overwhelmed by the very nation they had been told was too feeble to engage in conflict. Our Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We understood then that all was lost, not merely the war, but the entire Nazi endeavor. We had dared to challenge the world's preeminent industrial power with fanciful tales and racial myths. We dispatched cavalry against their armored vehicles, bolt-action rifles against their automatic weaponry, and mere courage against their boundless material capacity." Throughout their period of captivity, German prisoners encountered an element that, challenged Nazi ideology more profoundly than any material affluence: American humanitarianism. Despite propaganda that portrayed Americans as weak and overly sentimental, prisoners of war discovered a populace secure enough in its inherent strength to exhibit compassion. When Gerrit Hans Miller's son perished in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally conveyed the Red Cross notification and offered his sincere condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife communicated her struggles in providing for their children, American church groups dispatched vital food parcels to her in Germany, a nation that America was actively engaged in bombing. They drew a clear distinction between the German people and the Nazi regime, observed Hedman Otto. They proclaimed they were at war with Hitler, not with Germans. This separation, which initially seemed like a propaganda tactic, proved to be genuine. They prepared us for the reconstruction of Germany following the war, rather than for its complete annihilation. The medical treatment provided was particularly impactful for the prisoners. German physicians collaborated alongside American medical personnel, acquiring advanced techniques and utilizing state-of-the-art equipment. Prisoners underwent surgical procedures that, within Germany, would have been accessible only to the most privileged members of society. Mental health support, a concept virtually unknown within the Wehrmacht, was extended to soldiers suffering from trauma. Dr. Friedrich Bauer stated, "They addressed attempted suicides with therapeutic counseling rather than punitive measures. Prisoners experiencing emotional breakdowns received psychological therapy, not physical abuse." This compassionate approach towards former enemies revealed a strength we had never comprehended: the inherent confidence of true power. By March of 1945, the clandestine re-education program had yielded remarkable outcomes. Over 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in courses focused on democratic principles. The camp newspapers featured articles discussing constitutional governance, free market economies, and fundamental civil rights. Discussion groups were actively engaged in debates concerning Germany's future trajectory after the cessation of hostilities. The program's success far exceeded initial expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fervent adherents of Nazism were now composing essays advocating for democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn unwavering allegiance to Hitler were actively devising strategies for the implementation of American agricultural methodologies in a post-war Germany. "We transformed into missionaries for democracy," confessed Aust Hermann Göring, who bore no relation to the Reich Marshal, in a 1975 interview. "Not through compulsion or propaganda, but through direct observation. We witnessed its effectiveness. We saw ordinary individuals enjoying a standard of living superior to that of the German aristocracy. This was precisely what we desired for Germany. The transformation was so profound that American authorities expressed concern regarding the prisoners' excessive enthusiasm for American customs. Some individuals formally requested permission to remain in America following the conclusion of the war. Others entered into matrimonial unions with American women whom they had encountered through prison correspondence initiatives. Thousands would ultimately choose to immigrate to the United States during the 1950s. April of 1945 brought the ultimate revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps within Germany, graphic footage of these atrocities was presented to the German prisoners of war. Initially, many refused to accept the authenticity of the evidence, dismissing it as propaganda. However, the sheer volume of corroborating material was overwhelming. Testimonies from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually, letters from Germany confirming the horrific reality. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had clung to a degree of pride in German honor, even in the face of military defeat, were now confronted with the complete moral disintegration of their nation. Everything they had purportedly fought for was not merely vanquished, but exposed as fundamentally evil. Hedman Walter Schmidt penned the most eloquent summation of this profound realization. "We perceived ourselves as warriors championing a noble cause. We discovered we were merely instruments manipulated by criminals. We held the conviction that we were disseminating civilization to supposedly inferior populations. We then found ourselves to be the true barbarians. The Americans, whom we had derided as weak and morally degenerate, demonstrated to us the authentic meaning of civilization." As the war drew to a close in May of 1945, German prisoners of war faced repatriation with a complex mixture of emotions. They had borne witness to an America that diametrically opposed everything they had been taught to believe. They had experienced superior nourishment as prisoners compared to their time as soldiers. They had been treated with a greater degree of personal dignity by their enemies than they had received from their own government. The final months of their captivity were dedicated to preparing for their return to a devastated Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners were briefed on the impending Marshall Plan before its public announcement, understanding that America intended to facilitate Germany's reconstruction rather than exact retribution. "They prepared us to rebuild our nation," wrote Ost Friedrich von Tobin. "They imparted to us valuable skills, essential knowledge, and a renewed sense of hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into prospective citizens. This magnanimity extended by the victors was not an act of appeasement, but rather a calculated strategy." Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners of war were repatriated from American internment facilities. They returned to a Germany that was fractured, devastated, and impoverished. However, they carried with them a profound and invaluable asset: knowledge of how a prosperous democratic industrial society functioned. The German prisoners of war who experienced American prosperity inadvertently became agents of societal transformation within post-war Germany. They had personally witnessed industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and the tangible benefits of democratic governance. They understood that Reconstruction was not merely a theoretical possibility, but an achievable reality, having observed a society that had already attained it. Many former prisoners of war ascended to positions of significant influence in the rebuilding of West Germany. Hans Kroll, who had been a prisoner at Camp Shelby, later served as the West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who had conducted educational sessions at Camp Koenig, went on to become the president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Marx, detained at Camp Herne, assumed the role of Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, emerged as a pivotal figure in German agricultural reform. They introduced American methodologies into German industry, integrated American efficiency into German agriculture, and championed American democratic ideals within German politics. The celebrated economic miracle of the 1950s was, in part, constructed upon the knowledge and insights acquired within American prison camps. "We came to understand that prosperity stemmed from freedom, not from conquest," Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. "We observed that democracy fostered wealth, that diversity contributed to strength, and that equitable treatment of workers enhanced productivity. These invaluable lessons, learned during our internment, profoundly shaped the trajectory of the new Germany." Historians widely regard the German prisoner of war experience in America as one of the most successful re-education programs ever implemented in history. Without resorting to coercion or overt propaganda in the conventional sense, America's formidable industrial power and its democratic principles effectively reoriented hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program's success was rooted not in persuasive rhetoric, but in tangible, observable reality. Prisoners witnessed American society functioning at its peak efficiency while simultaneously extending dignified treatment to their adversaries. They observed an industrial capacity that rendered German production seemingly primitive. They experienced a standard of living that starkly exposed the hollow promises of Nazism. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading authority on German prisoners of war in America, concluded, "America triumphed in the propaganda war not through sophisticated messaging, but through sheer, undeniable reality. Every well-prepared meal, every functioning electric light, every sanitary toilet served as a compelling argument against Nazism. The prisoners of war were converted not by words, but by prosperity." Statistical data strongly supports this assessment. Of the 371,683 German prisoners held in American custody, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with a mere 2,222 total escape attempts recorded. Post-war surveys indicated that an astonishing 95% rated their treatment as either good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained ongoing correspondence with their American host families for several decades after the war's conclusion. In 1985, marking the 40th anniversary of the war's end, Surviving German prisoners of war convened for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners journeyed back to America, many accompanied by their families to personally show them the place where their profound transformation had begun. Former Oberreiter Hans Vea, who had been interned at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to establish a medical practice in Georgetown, Maine, delivered a poignant address at the reunion. Life within the camps represented a significant improvement for many of us who had grown up in modest accommodations in Germany. We discovered the convenience of running water, the comfort of central heating, and the availability of abundant food. But more profoundly, we discovered a sense of personal dignity. Former Stabsfeld Wiebel Kurt Meir, who had contributed to farm labor in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from their homes. They graciously shared their meals, imparted their knowledge, and at times even offered their homes. This humanity, extended by people whose own sons were engaged in conflict against us, fundamentally altered our perspectives forever." At the reunion dinner in 1985, former Obus Hermann Gutz, then 78 years of age, delivered the keynote speech encapsulating the essence of their transformative experience. "We arrived in America as adversaries, as adherents of Nazism, as believers in a profound falsehood. We departed as allies, as proponents of democracy, as individuals who had encountered undeniable truth. America demonstrated to us that true strength emanates not from subjugation, but from productive enterprise, not from animosity, but from embracing diversity, not from autocratic rule, but from the principles of freedom. We witnessed firsthand the arsenal of democracy operating at its absolute peak. We observed farmers who fed the world, laborers who forged the instruments of victory, and citizens who extended compassion to their former enemies. We learned that America's most potent weapon was not its arsenal of ordnance, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unwavering self-assurance. We returned to Germany with a singular mission: to forge a society capable of building rather than destroying, a society that could flourish through peaceful coexistence rather than perpetual conflict. The Germany that ultimately emerged from the ruins was constructed upon the invaluable lessons acquired within American internment camps. We who arrived as conquerors departed as eager students, extending our deepest gratitude to America from your former adversaries, who are now your friends. Thank you for illuminating the path forward." The auditorium resounded with a thunderous standing ovation. Americans and Germans, once adversaries, stood united in acknowledging a transformation that would have seemed utterly inconceivable when those initial transport trains arrived in Texas in June of 1943. The sheer scale and impact of the German prisoner of war experience in America can be quantified through stark statistical data, revealing both the immense scope of the undertaking and its extraordinary success. Camp infrastructure. Over 500 internment camps were established across 45 states, encompassing every state with the exception of Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. This network comprised 175 main camps, supplemented by 325 branch facilities. These camps were designed to accommodate populations ranging from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each, with construction timelines averaging a mere 90 days per facility. Prisoner population. A total of 371,683 German prisoners of war constituted a significant portion of the 425,871 total Axis prisoners held. The peak prisoner population was recorded in May of 1945. The influx of new arrivals averaged 20,000 per month in 1943, escalating to 30,000 per month following D-Day, and reaching 60,000 per month during the war's final months. Labor contribution. Prisoners collectively contributed 14 million man-days to agricultural labor, processed 100 million board feet of lumber, and their labor was valued at an estimated $230 million in the 1990s, 40s, with an average daily wage of 80 cents per prisoner. These laborers effectively filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics. From a total of over 371,000 prisoners, only 2,222 escape attempts were recorded, representing a mere 0.6% of the population. Crucially, there were 0 successful permanent escapes. The vast majority of escapees were apprehended within 24 hours of their attempt. and no American civilians suffered harm as a result of escaped prisoners. Educational programs. More than 40,000 prisoners enrolled in formal educational courses. 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 prisoners participated in English language classes. 15,000 received vocational training, and 8,000 benefited from university correspondence courses. Post-war immigration. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners of war chose to immigrate to the United States after the war concluded. Over 12,000 maintained ongoing correspondence with American families, with an average communication duration spanning 31 years. Many returned as tourists or established business partnerships. Treatment assessment. 95% of prisoners rated their treatment as either good or excellent. 74% believed their captivity had positively altered their worldview. 61% expressed a keen interest in learning about democracy. Fewer than 10% retained strong Nazi convictions by 1945. The German prisoners of war who experienced the full force of American industrial might did not merely observe history, they were profoundly reshaped by it. Their captivity transformed into an education, their defeat evolved into enlightenment, and their imprisonment became a liberation from the ideological shackles of Nazism. Ultimately, America's most significant triumph was not achieved on the battlefield, but within the confines of its prison camps, where the overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete reorientation of enemy minds. The German prisoners of war initially arrived in America, harboring a firm belief in the supremacy of their own nation and a dismissive view of American capabilities. However, their departure revealed a starkly different reality. The sheer scale of American industrial production was not merely significant, it was utterly beyond the comprehension of minds accustomed to deprivation and authoritarian rule. The very railway cars that had transported them into captivity in 1943 had been utilized to convey soldiers of the Third Reich, while the vessels that bore them back to Germany in 1946 carried the blueprints for a democratic future. They had witnessed a working model of progress, and their experience serves as a powerful testament to a fundamental truth. America's most potent asset was not its military hardware, but the undeniable and overwhelming evidence of a free society's inherent ability to generate prosperity. The German POWs were initially awestruck by American manufacturing prowess, but their encounter ultimately led to a profound shift in their perspective. This personal transformation sowed the seeds for Europe's recovery in the post-war era and signaled the eventual undoing of the Nazi ideology. They returned to their homeland not merely as vanquished adversaries, but as living proof of what liberated societies could accomplish. The remarkable economic resurgence that reshaped West Germany during the 1950s was underpinned by principles cultivated within American internment facilities, where enemy combatants discovered that true wealth stemmed from liberty, not from conquest, from recognizing human worth, not from racial dogma, and from collaborative democratic action, not from centralized autocratic control. The German prisoners of war had journeyed to the United States anticipating a nation fragmented and on the brink of collapse. Instead, they encountered an industrial titan possessing immense power and an unexpected depth of compassion. They had entered America as captives, yet departed as observers of the democratic arsenal at its zenith. Their astonishment at America's abundant resources provided the psychological impetus for the formation of the Atlantic Alliance, the implementation of the Marshall Plan, and the subsequent democratic reconstruction of Germany. Their encounter with America irrevocably altered them, and this profound impact would resonate through future generations. Their own children would mature within a democratic Germany, a nation allied with the United States, a partnership forged from the transformative experience that began when 185,000 veterans of the Africa Corps disembarked train in Mexico, Texas, and discovered their preconceived notions to be entirely erroneous. The narrative of German POWs in America is, at its core, a story of redemption achieved through enlightenment. It demonstrates that victories of immense significance are sometimes secured not through acts of destruction, but through the compelling demonstration of positive outcomes, not through manipulative propaganda, but through the tangible reality of widespread well-being, and not through animosity, but through acts of profound humanity. The German servicemen who bore witness to the formidable industrial capabilities of America inadvertently became emissaries of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the nascent ideas that would blossom into one of history's most successful national rebuilding efforts. Their metamorphosis from adherents of Nazism to proponents of democratic ideals remains one of the most extraordinary transformations in contemporary history, achieved not through coercion, but through the irrefutable evidence of what free individuals can achieve when united in common purpose. Ultimately, this was America's clandestine advantage. It was not solely its unparalleled capacity to produce armaments, but its ability to convert former adversaries into allies through the sheer persuasive power of example. The German POWs were indeed astounded by America's industrial might, but more crucially, they were fundamentally changed by it, and within that alteration lay the very bedrock of a more promising global future.